Today, I'm going to share a story with you about Elijah Carter, a man whose life was anything but ordinary. He's a former Green Beret sniper, a man who served his country with unmatched precision and then disappeared into the shadows of New York City. You might think his story is just another tale of a hero who's been forgotten, but you'd be wrong. Elijah didn't just walk away from the battle. He stepped into a new war, fighting a corrupt system from within the streets. What makes his story so incredible is how he went from a forgotten veteran to a force that no one could ignore. His life was shaped by sacrifice, courage, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. If you're someone who believes that true heroes are often the ones who go unnoticed, this is the story for you. It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest battles are fought in silence, and real change comes from the courage to stand up when no one else will. So grab your seat and get ready for a wild ride. And if you've ever had an experience where you stood up for what was right or witnessed an act of true bravery, I'd love to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Elijah Carter was no stranger to danger. Born and raised in the bustling streets of New York City, Elijah was molded into a person of strength and discipline from a young age. His father, a former military man, instilled in him the values of resilience, honor, and service. As a young man, Elijah found his purpose in the U.S. Army, where he quickly rose through the ranks due to his unparalleled precision and unwavering focus. He became one of the most lethal Green Beret snipers in history, a man who could hit a target from a mile away without breaking a sweat. But despite the accolades and recognition, there was one thing Elijah never could escape: the haunting memories of the missions he had been forced to carry out. After years of service, Elijah was left with nothing but the scars of war. Physically, he was a well-built, imposing figure, a man capable of taking down anyone who threatened him. But internally, he was struggling. The violence he had witnessed and participated in had taken a toll on his mental health, and he found himself fighting battles in his mind just as much as on the field. The emotional weight of war grew heavier each day, and eventually Elijah made the decision to walk away. He left the army, hoping to find peace in the anonymity of New York streets, but the city didn't offer the peace he hoped for. Instead, it consumed him. Elijah ended up homeless, living in the shadows of the towering buildings that once seemed like symbols of achievement. With the city's hustle and bustle around him, Elijah blended into the faceless crowd, unnoticed by the people who passed him every day. But beneath his worn jacket and scruffy beard, Elijah carried a lifetime of skills, experiences, and a quiet resolve. He was no longer the soldier who followed orders. He was now the man who would navigate the dark underbelly of the city, making his own rules. The pain of his past never left him, though. And while the city might have forgotten about him, Elijah had not forgotten the people who had been hurt by corruption and injustice, the very thing that drove him to serve in the first place. Little did anyone know, the man they saw as just another homeless soul had the power to take down a criminal empire. And he was about to prove it. This was the man who would change the course of history. Elijah Carter, the man who walked away from everything, only to become the hero the city didn't know it needed. But before he could become that hero, he had to confront the darkness that would soon pull him back into a battle far more dangerous than any he had faced before. The story of Elijah's rise from the streets would soon unfold, starting with an unexpected encounter with a corrupt police officer. The officer would make the mistake of underestimating him. Elijah had been trained for this, and when the moment came, Elijah would not hesitate. He was no longer the man who followed orders. He was the man who would enforce his own sense of justice. Elijah Carter had spent years trying to outrun his past. The streets of New York became his sanctuary, a place where no one would recognize the lethal soldier who had once taken down targets with the precision of a predator. Elijah lived in the shadows, hiding in plain sight, a ghost who blended with the other forgotten souls on the city's rough edges. His days were spent wandering, and his nights were spent tucked away in alleyways or empty buildings, just trying to survive. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Somewhere deep within him, a dormant fire still burned, one that could not be extinguished by the cold streets or the distant hum of traffic. The tipping point came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Elijah had just finished a meal at a diner. one of the few places he could rely on for a warm meal and a moment of peace. He sat at a corner booth, his coffee long gone cold, eyes scanning the room out of habit. He wasn't paranoid. He was just always alert. That was part of who he had become during his military days. His military training had ingrained in him the art of observation. Nothing escaped his notice. No one in the diner knew it, but Elijah was a predator watching the world unfold around him. And that night, he was about to be the prey. As the rain poured heavily outside, the sound of a patrol car pulling up outside disrupted his quiet evening. The police car's sirens were muted by the storm, but Elijah had learned to tune in to the sound of approaching danger. The flashing red and blue lights that bounced off the windows caught his attention. The car stopped in front of the diner, and 4 officers stepped out. Elijah knew one of them immediately, Officer Boon. Boon was a man who exuded authority, his broad shoulders and posture like that of someone used to giving orders. The officer had an air of arrogance, a look in his eye that made Elijah's skin crawl. Boon was the kind of man who thought he owned everything around him, especially the people in it. Elijah didn't move as the officers made their way inside. He kept his head low, his gaze averted as Boon scanned the diner, seemingly looking for something or someone. It was then that Elijah felt the tension shift. He had been in situations like this before, but there was something about Boon that sent a warning signal deep inside him. Maybe it was the way Boone's eye swept over him, dismissing him like a fly on the wall. Maybe it was the cold judgment he saw in the officer's face. Whatever it was, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was heading his way. As Boone and the other officers walked in, they stopped at the counter, speaking briefly to the waitress. But it wasn't until Boone's gaze landed on Elijah that the air in the room thickened. The officer's eyes locked with Elijah's for a moment, and a sneer tugged at the corner of his mouth. Elijah didn't flinch. He was used to the world's judgment, to being looked at like he didn't matter. But something about Boone's glare didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just judgment, it was disdain. Boone's footsteps echoed on the tile floor as he sauntered over to Elijah. "This spot's not a hotel, old-timer," he said, his voice laced with mockery. The words stung, but Elijah didn't react. He simply kept his eyes focused on the empty cup in front of him. Boone wasn't expecting that. He jabbed his baton into Elijah's side, making a loud click on the pavement. It was a warning, one that said, "Move or else." Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm talking to you," Boone barked, his tone growing sharper. He was trying to provoke a reaction. Any reaction. But Elijah wasn't in the mood for a fight. He didn't need to fight. He had learned the hard way that reacting to people like Boone would only give them power. Instead, Elijah remained still, his posture unyielding. He was the calm before the storm, and Boone didn't know it yet. "What's in the bag?" Boone asked, kicking the worn duffel bag beside Elijah's feet. "Booze? Drugs? Or just personal junk?" Elijah's eyes remained steady, his voice calm as he replied, "Personal items. Nothing illegal." But Boone wasn't satisfied. The officer kicked the bag again, sending it sliding across the wet pavement. As it skidded, the bag's contents spilled out onto the ground. A change of clothes, an old toothbrush, a crumpled book, and a small metal box that clattered against the concrete. It was that small metal box that caught Boone's attention. He picked it up, opening it with a smirk. Inside, Boone found a set of dog tags, their edges worn by years of use. He held them up like a trophy, dangling them in front of Elijah's face. "A military man, huh?" Boone scoffed. "Just another bum who couldn't hack it in civilian life?" Elijah stood. The movement was fluid, too smooth for someone who was supposedly down on his luck. The officers around Boone took a collective step back, unsure of what they were witnessing. But Elijah was still. His posture was disciplined, calm, and precise. He had seen men like Boone before, men who used their badge and power to intimidate those they deemed unworthy. "You should put those back," Elijah said quietly, his voice unwavering. Boone laughed. "Or what, old man? You gonna fight the whole police department?" The sneer on Boone's face deepened, but it was Elijah's unblinking gaze that made the officer pause. It was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt that flashed in Boone's eyes. But before he could react, Elijah spoke again, his voice low and measured. "I'm not bothering anyone. Elijah replied. You are. The encounter would set off a chain of events that none of them could predict. Elijah wasn't just a homeless man. He was a predator who had been forced to hide in the shadows, but now he was ready to fight back. The calm exterior was a mask, and behind it was a man with a past far darker and more dangerous than any of the officers could ever imagine. The following days were a blur for Elijah Carter. The brief encounter with Officer Boon had ignited something deep within him, something he thought he had buried long ago. He wasn't just a homeless man anymore. He was a man on a mission, a man with unfinished business. The years of suppression, of hiding in plain sight, had made him forget the power he once wielded. But now, as he lay awake in the small, dank apartment he'd retreated to, it was impossible to ignore the fire that had been relit within him. The predator had awoken. His mind kept racing back to that moment on the street, to the officer's sneering face, to the way Boone had underestimated him. Boone had no idea who Elijah really was, and that was about to change. No one in the city, in the world, was going to underestimate him again. The phone in his pocket buzzed, breaking his train of thought. Elijah reached for it, recognizing the number instantly. It was Colonel Briggs, a man who had known Elijah better than anyone in the field. Briggs was the one who had trained him, who had helped him become one of the deadliest snipers the military had ever seen. He was the one who had known how to manipulate his abilities, turn them into something greater than just a soldier. Elijah's past with Briggs had been complicated, but right now he needed allies, and Briggs was one of the few people left who understood the man Elijah had become. Carter, came the gravelly voice on the other end. Briggs, Elijah said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. I need to ask a favor. There was a moment of silence before Briggs spoke again, his tone softer. I thought you'd be calling soon. What's going on, Carter? I'm going after Langston, Elijah said, his voice cold and resolute. Briggs exhaled sharply. He knew exactly what that meant. Langston wasn't just any criminal. He was the kingpin, the mastermind behind one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in the world. But it wasn't just Langston Elijah was after. It was the entire empire. Drug trafficking, arms deals, human trafficking, the whole network. Elijah knew how to take down a system piece by piece, and that was exactly what he was going to do. I knew this day was coming, Briggs said after a pause. You sure you're ready for this? Langston's empire is massive, and he's got people everywhere. People with power. You can't take them all down on your own. Elijah's lips curled into a tight smile. I'm not on my own. I've got people who owe me favors. People who understand what Langston's empire really is. Briggs was silent for a moment. He knew that Elijah wasn't the type of man to ask for help, but he also knew the stakes. Elijah was going after Langston, and if anyone could bring him down, it was Elijah. The question was, how far was Elijah willing to go? Was he ready to expose everything, to bring the whole corrupt system crashing down? I'll get the information you need, Briggs said, his voice full of resolve. But you need to lay low for a while. Langston's men are already looking for you. They'll stop at nothing to get rid of you. I know, Elijah replied, but I'm not hiding anymore. It's time to make them pay for what they've done. After a few more words of caution, the call ended. Elijah sat in silence for a while, the weight of his decision sinking in. He had chosen this path long ago, but now there was no turning back. Langston's empire had to fall, and Elijah was going to be the one to bring it down. That night he moved quickly through the streets, blending with the shadows. His destination was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, one that Langston's organization used as a front for some of their less legitimate dealings. Elijah knew the area well. He had been here before, years ago, during his time as a covert operator. He knew the layout, knew where the guards were stationed, and knew where the information was kept. This wasn't just a mission, it was personal. As Elijah approached the warehouse, he could hear the low hum of a generator running in the background. The place was guarded, but not well enough to stop someone like him. He had spent years evading detection, slipping through tight security, and taking down targets without anyone knowing he was there. Tonight, he would be the ghost once again. Elijah approached the back entrance, a small, nondescript door that had been used more times than he could count. He had scouted this place many times before. He knew every inch of it, The door was unlocked just as he expected. With one swift motion, he slipped inside, his boots making no sound against the concrete floor. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, with large crates stacked high, obscuring most of the space. Elijah moved swiftly, his movements calculated and precise. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. The files he needed were kept in a small office tucked away in the far corner of the building. He knew exactly where they were. As he approached the office, Elijah noticed two guards standing near the entrance. They were armed and alert, but they weren't expecting someone like him. He slipped behind a stack of crates, his body pressing against the cold metal. His breathing slowed, and he waited. He knew that the moment the guards moved, he would strike. It didn't take long. One of the guards turned, moving toward the back of the warehouse. Elijah made his move. He was fast, silent, and deadly. His hands shot out, grabbing the guard by the throat and pulling him into the shadows. The guard never had a chance to react. A quick, efficient strike to the neck left him unconscious, his body limp in Elijah's arms. The second guard turned just in time to see his partner collapse. But before he could react, Elijah was on him, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. The force of the punch sent the guard crashing to the ground. He was out cold before he even hit the floor. With the guards down, Elijah slipped into the office, moving quickly toward the desk. He didn't need to search for long. The file he was looking for was sitting on the corner of the desk, its label clearly marked Port Facility. Elijah grabbed the file, quickly scanning through its contents. It was everything he needed, detailed plans of Langston's operations, including shipments, locations, and dates. But there was one thing that stood out to him. The word merchandise linked to a shipment scheduled through Langston's port facility. The word was a cover for something much darker. Children. Children who were being trafficked for profit. A cold wave of anger washed over Elijah. He had seen enough horror in his life. But this was different. Langston wasn't just a criminal. He was a monster. And Elijah wasn't going to stop until the empire he had built on the suffering of others was no more. As he made his way out of the warehouse, Elijah felt a new determination surge through him. He had the proof, and now Langston's empire was on borrowed time. The war was far from over, but this was the beginning of the end. The cold night air felt like a sharpening tool against Elijah's senses. His body was ready, his mind clear, and his mission set. He had the file. He had the intel on Langston's operation, but it wasn't enough just to expose the criminal kingpin. He had to bring down everything. Langston's empire wasn't just built on drugs, arms deals, or trafficking. It was a well-oiled machine of power, corruption, and manipulation, with tendrils deep into the very system meant to protect people. The corruption ran deep, and Elijah Carter was determined to ensure that it didn't survive. As the shadows of the city consumed the streets around him, Elijah's thoughts kept returning to one thing: the children. The file had detailed shipments, the type of merchandise they were transporting, and how Langston's network moved these innocent lives across borders. The anger inside him was cold and calculating, but there was something deeper, a quiet determination to see justice served. For him, this wasn't just about taking down a criminal mastermind. It was about saving those who had no voice. Elijah had always been a man of precision, of cold calculations. Every move was deliberate, every step measured. His training had made him into something more than just a soldier or a sniper. It had honed him into a predator, a force of nature that could disappear in plain sight, strike without warning, and leave nothing behind but chaos. The city, so full of life and noise, had no idea it was about to be shaken to its core. The first part of the plan was simple: gather allies. Elijah couldn't take on Langston's empire alone. Not when Langston had so many resources at his disposal. He needed to find people who were willing to step into the shadows with him. People who had been hurt by Langston's operations. People who understood the stakes. His first stop was an old contact, Greg, a former journalist who had once exposed government corruption but had paid a heavy price for it. Greg had been blacklisted, his career ruined. But Elijah knew he could trust him. They had worked together before, and the truth they had uncovered about Langston had led them both to dangerous waters. But Greg was the kind of man who understood that doing what was right often came at a cost. Elijah knew he could count on him. Greg's apartment was on the 5th floor of a rundown building, the kind of place that didn't attract attention. Elijah climbed the stairs with quiet, measured steps, making sure his presence went unnoticed. He knocked softly on Greg's door. When it opened, Elijah was met with the tired face of his old friend. Greg hadn't aged well. Years of fighting the system had left their mark on him, but Elijah saw the same fire in his eyes that had been there years ago. "Carter," Greg said, stepping aside to let Elijah in. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I've got something you need to see," Elijah replied, his tone grave. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed Greg the file. "Everything you need to bring down Langston is in here. We've got a shot at exposing him, but we need to move fast. Time's running out." Greg flipped through the file, his brow furrowing as he read the contents. His expression hardened as he reached the section detailing Langston's trafficking operation. The reality of it hit him hard, just as it had Elijah. They had known Langston was bad, but the extent of his operation was far worse than they had imagined. "We can't let him get away with this," Greg said, his voice thick with anger. "These people, these kids, they deserve to be saved." "We will save them," Elijah said, his voice steady but firm. "But we need to be careful. Langston's not just some small-time crook. He's got the whole system on his side. Law enforcement, politicians, businessmen. The only way to bring him down is to cut off the head of the snake. We need to hit him where it hurts." Greg looked up from the file, his gaze meeting Elijah's. "You've thought this through, haven't you? This is bigger than anything we've ever tackled." Elijah nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. "It's not just about exposing him. We need to dismantle his empire, piece by piece. First, we get the evidence to the right people, then we hit his supply lines. We'll start with the port facility. It's his main hub." Greg set the file down and rubbed his temples. "You know what you're asking, right? You're not just going after a criminal empire. You're going after a system. Langston's got friends in high places. This could destroy everything." "Everything's already destroyed," Elijah replied. "Langston's just a symptom of the corruption that's been festering in this city. If we don't stop him, there will be more people like him. More people who think they're above the law. I'm not running anymore. This ends with him." Greg nodded slowly, the weight of Elijah's words settling in. He knew that Elijah was right, even if it meant putting everything on the line. "Okay, let's do it. But we'll need more than just the two of us." "I've already made some calls," Elijah said. "I've got people who can help, people who know how to move in the shadows. We just need to be smart about it. We move quickly, we move quietly, and we hit hard." With the plan in motion, Elijah and Greg set their sights on Langston's operation. They knew they couldn't do it alone. Elijah reached out to old contacts, former soldiers, ex-law enforcement officers, anyone who owed him a favor or had a reason to want Langston taken down. He didn't trust easily, but these were people who had fought alongside him in the past, people who knew the stakes. As the days passed, Elijah's network began to form. They gathered in the shadows away from prying eyes. They were the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones who had been wronged by the system and left to fend for themselves. But together, they were a force to be reckoned with. The plan was simple: expose Langston's operations, disrupt his supply lines, and create enough chaos to force him out of hiding. But there was one more step: taking Langston down. The night of the operation arrived, and Elijah's team moved into position. The port facility was their first target. It was a massive compound, guarded by private security and some of Langston's toughest men. Elijah knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be risks, but he was ready. His team was ready. They infiltrated the compound under the cover of darkness, their movements swift and silent. Elijah led the charge, his eyes scanning the perimeter, his every step calculated. He could hear the faint sound of voices ahead, the low murmur of guards talking as they walked their patrols. Elijah signaled to his team, and they moved into position. The first guard went down quickly. No noise, no fuss. Elijah had trained his team well. They knew when to strike and when to stay hidden. One by one, the guards were neutralized, leaving the way clear for the team to enter the building. Inside, the operation was already in motion. Cargo was being processed, merchandise moved from one area to another. Elijah and his team made their way to the main office. The files they needed were inside, Langston's key to the operation. They found the safe and cracked it open, pulling out the documents that would expose everything. But just as they were about to leave, a sound rang out, footsteps approaching fast. Elijah motioned for his team to fall back. They weren't done yet. They had what they needed, but now they had to get out before Langston's men arrived. The pursuit was on. Elijah's pulse quickened, but his focus didn't waver. The hunt was just beginning, and Elijah Carter had no intention of losing this fight. The night stretched on, the hunt intensifying. Elijah knew that Langston's empire wouldn't fall easily, but one thing was certain. They were finally in motion, and there was no turning back now. Elijah Carter stood still in the dark alley, his breath steady, his eyes scanning the faint glow of the streetlights that barely pierced the fog. He was no longer just a man on the run. He was a force of nature. The predator had awoken, and tonight, nothing would stop him from taking down Langston's empire. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, eyes never leaving the alley ahead of him. It was Greg, his trusted contact, the journalist who had helped him get this far. "It's done," Greg's voice crackled over the line, the words carrying a sense of finality. "Langston's been spooked. His men are on high alert, but they don't know what's coming. We've got them right where we want them." Elijah allowed himself a small smile, though the weight of the task ahead pressed heavily on his chest. This was the moment he had been planning for, the moment when Langston would no longer be untouchable. But the work wasn't over. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Every second mattered now. "Good work, Greg," Elijah replied, his voice calm and calculated. "We're going in tonight. I've got the intel we need, and I'm taking it straight to Langston's door. This ends tonight." Greg hesitated for a moment before responding. "Be careful, Elijah. Langston's not a fool. He'll have every resource at his disposal. If you go in blind—" "I won't," Elijah interrupted, his voice low. "I've been doing this long enough to know how to stay one step ahead." The line clicked off as Greg hung up, and Elijah slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket. He took a deep breath, letting the chill of the night air clear his thoughts. The city stretched out before him, oblivious to the danger that lurked in its depths. But Elijah was no longer just a part of it. He was the hunter now, and Langston's empire would fall tonight. Elijah moved silently through the city, his footsteps barely making a sound on the wet pavement. His training had made him into something more than just a man. He was a ghost, a predator who could move through the shadows, unnoticed, leaving only chaos in his wake. He had spent years in the darkness, hiding from a world that didn't care about him or the sacrifices he had made. But tonight, the shadows would be his ally, his target. Langston's mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high walls and armed guards. Elijah had spent days studying the property, memorizing the guards' shifts, the security systems, the weak points in the perimeter. He had the advantage. Langston had underestimated him, and now it was time for the kingpin to face the consequences of his own arrogance. The mansion loomed ahead, a towering symbol of the wealth and power that Langston had accumulated at the expense of countless lives. Elijah's heart rate remained steady as he approached the gates, his eyes flicking to the guards patrolling the grounds. They didn't see him, didn't hear him. He was already inside the compound, slipping past the high walls with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The plan was simple. Get in, eliminate the men closest to Langston, and then confront the man himself. It would be quick, clean, and efficient, everything Elijah had been trained to do. But he knew there was no room for error. If Langston's men caught wind of what was happening, it could turn into a bloodbath. Elijah wouldn't allow that. Not tonight. He crept through the shadows, his movements swift and silent, blending into the darkness like a shadow himself. The guards had no idea he was there, their attention focused on the main entrance, unaware of the man who had already infiltrated their compound. Elijah's every step was calculated, his focus razor sharp. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now, not with so much on the line. The mansion was eerily quiet as he moved through the halls, his senses heightened. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards was amplified in the stillness. Elijah knew Langston's men would be holed up inside, preparing for their next move. They had no idea their empire was about to crumble. Elijah reached the door to the main room where Langston would be holding court. His pulse quickened, but his body remained steady. The moment of confrontation was near. He could hear voices inside, men discussing plans, exchanging information, unaware of the storm about to hit. He paused for a moment, listening to the conversation on the other side of the door. Langston's voice rang out, cold and calculating. "We can't afford to let Carter slip away. He's a threat to everything we've built. Make sure the shipment goes through tonight, and get rid of anyone who stands in our way." Elijah's jaw clenched at the mention of his name. Langston had no idea who he was dealing with. He wasn't just some former soldier or ex-assassin. He was the one who would bring everything crashing down. The moment had arrived. Elijah kicked the door open, moving with deadly precision. The men inside froze, their eyes widening as they realized what was happening. There was no time for words, no room for negotiations. This was the end. Elijah's gun was in his hand before anyone had a chance to react. The first two men went down in an instant, their bodies crumpling to the floor without a sound. Elijah didn't stop to check for pulses. There was no time. His eyes locked onto Langston, who was now standing at the back of the room, a gun in hand, his face twisted with anger and fear. "You think you can stop me?" Langston spat, his voice dripping with venom. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. His only goal was to end this nightmare once and for all. Langston raised his gun, but Elijah was faster. He moved like lightning, closing the distance between them in seconds. Before Langston could even squeeze the trigger, Elijah had him on the ground, the gun knocked from his hand, and his life hanging by a thread. "This ends tonight," Elijah said, his voice low and steady. Langston struggled beneath him, but there was no escape. The predator had him now. Elijah's grip tightened as he looked into Langston's eyes, seeing the fear that had never been there before. Langston had always been the one pulling the strings, the one hiding behind money and power. But now he was the one being hunted. "You can't kill me," Langston snarled. "You have no idea what you're doing. I have the city in my pocket. I own this place." "You owned it until now," Elijah replied, "and I'm taking it back." With that, Elijah's hand tightened, and Langston's struggles came to an end. The kingpin of the city was dead, his empire crumbling in the wake of Elijah's actions. Elijah stood over him, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The room was silent now, the echoes of gunshots still hanging in the air. Langston's empire had been brought to its knees, but Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. Langston's men would scatter, but the corruption would remain. There were still people to bring down, still battles to be fought. But for now, Elijah Carter had won. The predator had completed his hunt. The game was over, and the world was a little bit safer. As the rain continued to fall in torrents, Elijah stood outside Langston's mansion, the weight of the night's actions settling on his shoulders. His chest was still heavy with the echo of gunfire, and the stillness of the moment hung in the air. He had done it. Langston, the ruthless kingpin who had corrupted so many, was dead. His empire, built on a foundation of blood and lies, had crumbled under Elijah's precise strike. Yet despite the victory, Elijah felt no sense of triumph. It was a hollow victory. Langston's fall was just the beginning of the long road Elijah had to walk. As he turned to leave the mansion, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Greg, the journalist who had been working with him behind the scenes. The file he had stolen earlier, filled with damning evidence of Langston's operations, had been delivered to the authorities. The FBI was now involved, and Langston's criminal network would be dismantled from the inside. Elijah had provided the final piece of the puzzle, and with it, Langston's empire would finally be exposed. But Elijah didn't feel the relief that should have come with his success. He didn't feel the closure. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces still left in place. For years, he had been a tool of destruction, trained to kill without hesitation, without mercy. But tonight, as he walked away from Langston's mansion, he felt the full weight of what he had become. A man with blood on his hands, not just from the enemies he had fought, but from a system that had shaped him into a weapon. A system that had taken everything from him, his family, his humanity, his soul. Elijah's steps were slow, deliberate. each one echoing in the empty streets as he made his way through the winding alleys. The world was still asleep, unaware of the shift that had just occurred. But for Elijah, there was no sleep, no peace. He had given up on that long ago. His mind kept returning to the people he had left behind, the family he had once known, the friends he had lost in the course of his work. He had chosen the path of violence to protect them, to shield them from the darkness. But now, as he walked away from Langston's mansion, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Had he really saved them, or had he just become another monster in a world full of them? He passed the alley where he had first crossed paths with Officer Reynolds, the rookie cop who had witnessed the tension between him and the corrupt officers. Elijah remembered the way Reynolds had reacted to his presence, his unease and hesitation. But tonight, Reynolds wasn't there. There was no one left to witness Elijah's actions, to pass judgment on the choices he had made. As Elijah continued down the darkened streets, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Colonel Briggs, the man who had once been his commanding officer in the field, the man who had taught him how to survive the chaos of war. Briggs had always been there when Elijah needed him, but this message was different. It was brief and its tone was urgent. "Langston's dead. We've got a bigger problem." Elijah stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. A bigger problem? What could be worse than taking down Langston? Elijah had put everything into this. He had taken on Langston's empire head first, risking his life, his identity, everything. He had made sure the criminal network was going to fall apart, that those responsible for the horrors Langston had inflicted on the innocent would face justice. But now there was something more, something he wasn't prepared for. He quickly dialed Briggs' number, his fingers trembling slightly as the call connected. "Briggs," Elijah said, his voice low, the weight of exhaustion creeping in. "What the hell is going on?" "It's bigger than Langston, Carter," Briggs replied, his voice grim. "We've got intel. Langston wasn't the only player in this game. There's a much larger operation at play, one that involves people at the highest levels. We're talking politicians, CEOs, military contractors, people who have been pulling the strings for years. Langston was just a pawn, and now that he's dead, we're in the middle of a power vacuum." Elijah's pulse quickened. "Who else is involved?" "I can't say yet, but trust me, Carter, you've taken down one part of the system, but there's still so much left to unravel. You've made a lot of enemies tonight. You're not done yet." Elijah's mind raced. The mission was supposed to be simple: eliminate Langston and end the cycle of corruption and violence. But now it seemed like the battle was just beginning. He hadn't just stepped into the world of criminals and corruption. He had unwittingly triggered a much larger storm. "Are you saying I'm not done?" Elijah asked, his voice cold with the realization that the path he had chosen was going to be even darker than he had imagined. "You are never done, Carter," Briggs replied. "You've started something tonight. Whether you want to or not, you're in this fight until it's finished." Elijah didn't respond immediately. His mind was already processing the new information, the weight of the words hanging heavily in the air. Langston's death had been necessary, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far more dangerous, far more complicated. He had thought he could walk away from the chaos, that he could finally be free of the violence that had defined his life. But freedom, it seemed, was an illusion. "I'll finish it," Elijah said finally, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "But I'm not doing it alone." "Good," Briggs replied. "We'll help you, but you need to be careful. This isn't just about taking down criminals anymore. It's about exposing the system that allowed them to thrive. You've got the evidence. Now you need to make sure it doesn't disappear into the shadows again." Elijah ended the call and stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in. His fight had never been just about Langston, or even about the criminals who had orchestrated the world of violence and oppression. It had always been about the system itself, the ones who held the power and pulled the strings, the ones who profited from the suffering of others. Elijah knew now that there was no turning back. He had crossed the line, and he couldn't undo what he had done. But maybe, just maybe, he could make sure that the future was different, that the world he had lived in for so long, a world of shadows and violence, could be changed. The rain continued to fall, the city now a blur of lights and dark alleys. Elijah's steps were resolute, his mission far from over. The fight for redemption would not be easy, but it was a fight he was ready to finish. Because if anyone could change the system, it was the man who had already survived it. Elijah Carter, the predator who had once been hunted, was now the one in control. And he wasn't going to stop until the entire system fell. Elijah Carter's resolve had never been clearer than it was tonight. Standing in the shadows outside Langston's safe house, his mind was a calm storm of calculated precision. The storm clouds loomed overhead, matching the dark, intense atmosphere surrounding him. Elijah had done the impossible. He had taken down Langston, the empire that had terrorized countless lives for years. But as Briggs had warned, Langston was just one cog in a much larger machine. Tonight was about dismantling the rest of it. Tonight, Elijah was going after the true architects of this corruption, those who had operated in the shadows for too long. His target wasn't just Langston's immediate network. It was bigger than that. It was the high-ranking officials who had protected Langston, the businessmen who had funded his empire, and the politicians who had looked the other way while people suffered. They were the ones pulling the strings, the ones who had kept the system of exploitation alive. And now they would all pay the price for their complicity. As Elijah crouched behind a rusted dumpster, he watched the well-guarded safe house in front of him. The building stood as a monument to secrecy, its high walls and security systems designed to keep intruders out. But Elijah wasn't just anyone. He wasn't an intruder. He was a ghost, a trained predator who had learned to move undetected, to infiltrate where others would fail. The only difference now was that he wasn't just a soldier on a mission. He was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting to expose the system for what it truly was. Elijah's fingers tightened around the hilt of his combat knife. The blade was a reminder of who he had been, the skilled Green Beret sniper, the man who had taken down countless enemies, both foreign and domestic. But now it wasn't about physical combat. It was about strategy, patience, and making sure that the people who thought they were untouchable would finally be brought to justice. He had waited for this moment for years. This was his chance to take down the system and make sure that no one else would have to suffer as he had. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he slid it out with quick precision, his eyes never leaving the house. It was a message from Greg, his old contact, the journalist who had been feeding him information about Langston's network. The file had been handed to the FBI, but the truth was Elijah didn't trust anyone fully. The government might be involved, but Elijah knew better than to rely solely on them. He would need to handle this himself. "The safe house is clear. Meet me at the rendezvous point when you're done," the message read. Elijah didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had already planned his exit strategy. As soon as he was done here, he would rendezvous with Greg and make sure the evidence he had gathered was safe. The truth needed to be exposed, but Elijah also knew that the fight wasn't over yet. There would be others like Langston, others who operated in the shadows, and Elijah would be there to make sure they fell too. With his plan in mind, Elijah moved with the deadly quiet precision he was known for. He circled the perimeter of the safe house, avoiding the security cameras and making his way toward the back entrance. It was locked, but Elijah had tools for this. In moments, he had bypassed the lock and slipped inside, blending into the darkness like a shadow. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, but Elijah knew exactly where he was going. His target wasn't the building itself. It was the men inside, those who had turned a blind eye to the suffering of others. They were the ones who had built their wealth and power on the backs of the weak. Tonight, their empire would fall. Elijah's senses were heightened as he moved through the corridors. He could hear the faint murmur of voices ahead. He was getting closer, but instead of rushing, he took his time, listening, planning his next move. The first man he would take down was the one who had been pulling the strings, Victor Langston's right-hand man, the one who had kept the operation running while Langston played the role of the untouchable kingpin. The rain continued to fall, the city now a blur of lights and dark alleys. Elijah's steps were resolute, his mission far from over. The fight for redemption would not be easy, but it was a fight he was ready to finish. Because if anyone could change the system, it was the man who had already survived it. Elijah Carter, The predator who had once been hunted was now the one in control, and he wasn't going to stop until the entire system fell. Elijah Carter's resolve had never been clearer than it was tonight. Standing in the shadows outside Langston's safe house, his mind was a calm storm of calculated precision. The storm clouds loomed overhead, matching the dark, intense atmosphere surrounding him. Elijah had done the impossible. He had taken down Langston, the empire that had terrorized countless lives for years. But as Briggs had warned, Langston was just one cog in a much larger machine. Tonight was about dismantling the rest of it. Tonight, Elijah was going after the true architects of this corruption, those who had operated in the shadows for too long. His target wasn't just Langston's immediate network. It was bigger than that. It was the high-ranking officials who had protected Langston, the businessmen who had funded his empire, and the politicians who had looked the other way while people suffered. They were the ones pulling the strings, the ones who had kept the system of exploitation alive. And now they would all pay the price for their complicity. As Elijah crouched behind a rusted dumpster, he watched the well-guarded safe house in front of him. The building stood as a monument to secrecy, its high walls and security systems designed to keep intruders out. But Elijah wasn't just anyone. He wasn't an intruder. He was a ghost, a trained predator who had learned to move undetected, to infiltrate where others would fail. The only difference now was that he wasn't just a soldier on a mission. He was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting to expose the system for what it truly was. Elijah's fingers tightened around the hilt of his combat knife. The blade was a reminder of who he had been, the skilled Green Beret sniper, the man who had taken down countless enemies, both foreign and domestic. But now it wasn't about physical combat. It was about strategy, patience, and making sure that the people who thought they were untouchable would finally be brought to justice. He had waited for this moment for years. This was his chance to take down the system and make sure that no one else would have to suffer as he had. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he slid it out with quick precision, his eyes never leaving the house. It was a message from Greg, his old contact, the journalist who had been feeding him information about Langston's network. The file had been handed to the FBI, but the truth was Elijah didn't trust anyone fully. The government might be involved, but Elijah knew better than to rely solely on them. He would need to handle this himself. "The safe house is clear. Meet me at the rendezvous point when you're done," the message read. Elijah didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had already planned his exit strategy. As soon as he was done here, he would rendezvous with Greg and make sure the evidence he had gathered was safe. The truth needed to be exposed, but Elijah also knew that the fight wasn't over yet. There would be others like Langston, others who operated in the shadows, and Elijah would be there to make sure they fell too. With his plan in mind, Elijah moved with the deadly quiet precision he was known for. He circled the perimeter of the safe house, avoiding the security cameras and making his way toward the back entrance. It was locked, but Elijah had tools for this. In moments, he had bypassed the lock and slipped inside, blending into the darkness like a shadow. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, but Elijah knew exactly where he was going. His target wasn't the building itself. It was the men inside, those who had turned a blind eye to the suffering of others. They were the ones who had built their wealth and power on the backs of the weak. Tonight, their empire would fall. Elijah's senses were heightened as he moved through the corridors. He could hear the faint murmur of voices ahead. He was getting closer, but instead of rushing, he took his time, listening, planning his next move. The first man he would take down was the one who had been pulling the strings, Victor Langston's right-hand man, the one who had kept the operation running while Langston played the role of the untouchable kingpin. One important lesson from this story is the power of standing up for what's right, even when it seems like the odds are against you. Elijah Carter, once a government assassin, uses his skills not for personal gain, but to dismantle a corrupt system that has caused harm to many. His story teaches us that it's never too late to take action, especially when faced with injustice. For those of us who have lived through many decades, we've seen how society can sometimes overlook the value of individuals, especially those who may not have wealth or power. But just like Elijah, Every one of us has the ability to make a difference, to stand firm against wrongdoing, and to fight for fairness. It's a reminder that the choices we make, whether in our daily lives or in more significant moments, have the potential to shape a better world for future generations. In our later years, we often have the wisdom to recognize injustice. And while we may not have the energy of youth, we can still find ways to speak up, share our experiences, and contribute to positive change. The story encourages us to never underestimate the impact of our actions, no matter how big or small. So let's stand up for what's right, knowing that even one voice can bring about profound change.